Okay.
Anyway, so look, thanks very much, guys, for joining us. What we want to do, we're going to talk about EuroPCom. We're going to talk about your two sessions mainly. So just for those people who might watch this video later, EuroPCom is this conference about public communications in Europe, and the purpose really is of this session is to talk about your two workshops. So maybe the first thing to do really is to introduce you guys. Charlie, you're left of on the screen, so you start.
Okay, perfect. So my name is Charlelie. I'm the creative director of a young agency called Old Continent, based in Brussels. We work mainly in the field of campaigning, digital campaigning, producing videos, all these sort of tools that our client requests. And we're working mainly with the European institutions, NGOs based in Brussels, and private companies who have European offices. So that's it. And for the EuroPCom conference, I will be moderating the panel 23, which is called Images That Tell a Story.
Okay, thanks very much. Okay, over to you, Ezri.
Okay, I'm Ezri. I'm a writer and lecturer, and I help organisations to tell their story, engage with their stakeholders, and I use lots of storytelling and design thinking to help them do that. So one of my clients is the European Training Foundation, and we'll be working together to produce a Rapido session at EuroPCom in a couple of weeks' time. Rapido is a different type of format, and we can talk about that in a bit more detail, but the session will be immediately before the closing plenary.
Yeah, on the website, it's actually listed as part of the closing plenary, but it's sort of like integrated into the closing plenary, but it's actually going to be Rapido and then the park and buck of the.
Exactly. It will be. We'll be in the same room. All the delegates will be gathered in that room. We will do our Rapido for about 50 minutes. I think we've got 50, maybe 55 minutes, and then immediately after that, the closing keynote speakers will take to the stage. So, if things go according to plan, the delegates will be in a state of high excitement when the last two speakers come on, and hopefully it will be a very high energy way to close the conference.
That'll be a nice change from most conferences. Okay, so and you guys met on a group that I set up on the Knowledge Hub, which was set up with the same purpose as the EuroPCom conference, and because it's set up a few weeks before the EuroPCom conference, the main focus of discussion has been about the conference workshops. I hope that this group will continue. I mean, it's starting very slowly. We've only got a bit over 30 members so far. But you two were some of the more active members. You both introduced your sessions independently, and then you both met each other on the forums in there, and you were discussing the fact that there are some parallels. And those parallels come down to the use of visuals, right? So that's why I thought we would have this this session. This is not a polished video. This, for everybody else who may be watching one day. Oh, we have a viewer. I don't know who it is. But anyway, if this is not a polished video, this is just a conversation between three people who have a common topic of interest, and we thought we'd make it live. So here you are. If you have any questions, anybody, please use the Q&A app on the Hangout. I have no idea how it works. I can't guarantee we'll be able to answer it because I don't know how it works, but I'm sort of just curious to see how that works. So the key common factor between the two of you would seem to be the use of visual communications, right? It's inherent in Charlelie's session, and I think I remember reading somewhere, Ezri, you said that people in their Rapido contribution need to use visuals because otherwise it's death by PowerPoint.
Yeah.
Could you, perhaps, we'll start with Ezri. What does a Rapido mean anyway?
Okay. So this came about actually at a previous event in Brussels in 2013. It was the International Association of Business Communicators Europe Region Conference, and I'd been asked to come up with a session that would try and sort of change the typical format a bit. And I'd recently been involved in something called Pecha Kucha here in London, which is a presentation format created by designers who wanted to share new ideas and talk about projects, where they limited each presentation to 20 slides, and each slide would advance automatically after 20 seconds. So no speaker could speak for more than roughly 6.5 minutes. And because it came from the design community, it had a very strong visual ethos from the beginning. So it soon got picked up in other fields and other sectors, but that sense that the slides were there for showing images rather than text very much came with it. However, given that this was a bunch of business comms people, I thought 6.5 minutes is probably still too long. So I set the time limit at 5 minutes, and also decided that given the nature of the conference, there should be an element of curation. And that means that I would get all the slides in from all the presenters, and in the first Rapido session ever back in Brussels in 2013, we had, I think, 14 presenters, one after the other. And I decided on the order. I worked with the presenters on the quality of their images and so on. So that element became very important. So although it's really an opportunity for a 5-minute story, because that's the best way to keep the audience interested. People get up and say something, tell a story about themselves, about their experience of the conference, or about something they've brought from their daily work. They did need to think about how the visuals were going to support that story. So that's where the sort of strength of the visual element in Rapido comes from. Although essentially, you could stand up and give a Rapido 5-minute presentation with no images. It's entirely possible.
But what are they going to be talking about? I mean, they've only got 5 minutes. They have to use images, or they should use images. Everybody should use images. But what are they going to be talking about? For example, at the conference in EuroPCom, can they talk about anything they like? Or?
No, they're always given a theme. Otherwise, it would be too disparate. And the theme for EuroPCom is what makes you feel European.
Okay.
Within that, they have a completely free hand, and I've already been engaging in some correspondence with my presenters about what they might do in order to meet the brief and bring in the subject matter that they actually want to talk about. And that's part of the curation process as well.
But then, can there be much of a discussion? Because if they've got 5 minutes to tell a story, then they can tell their story, then they're off and the next person comes on.
Exactly.
Where does the conversation happen?
The idea is that the speed of the presentations and the sort of the combination of different presenters will spark a lot of conversation. But that conversation happens in the coffee break or over lunch or after the conference and can carry on online as well. There's no Q&A like you would get in a traditional presentation.
I look forward to seeing it, because I look forward to figuring out how you can bring that online as well. And that would bring me to this thing called Assesstude. But before we get to that, because that's just text, across to Charlelie. I noticed Old Continent when you came up with that wonderful one-day video that you did for the European Parliament elections that many people thought was better than the very expensive campaign that was set up, and you guys did it in one day. It wasn't just the way you did it. I actually really appreciated and got the message, which we won't go into now. But in one day, you strung some images together with a voiceover and really had a big impact, and so that seems to be the thing that Old Continent has, unlike many of the other consultancies around Brussels. What are you going to be doing at the EuroPCom conference?
So basically, a couple of months ago, we started to organize a workshop with the company to try to train communication officers, people who work for potentially our clients, to train them on strategy of communication. And I think that's one thing that lack a lot in Brussels. We tend, and most of our clients tend to come with solutions and ask us to produce them. Yeah. While most of very successful campaigns in the world start with a client coming with a problem and asking for creatives to come up with a creative solution. And I thought it was very necessary to create this sort of workshops. Among one of the sessions we organized, we asked to the European Space Agency and the Professor Mark Corgran, to explain how he came up with a superb campaign called Ambition that he made for the landing of the Philae robot on the comet a couple of months ago. It was a massive success in the European Union as a scientific expedition, but also as a communication campaign. And we asked him basically to detail the process he put in place to be able to pass such an idea into an institution, which is the European Space Agency, which looks a lot like our clients, like the European Commission or the European Parliament. How he made it possible, basically. So we built a case, and we really lobbied EuroPCom to take him on board as a speaker, because we think that his experience can really help others build similar campaigns. So Tom de Smet invited me to moderate the panel because basically we brought Mark on board, and because I can raise this question about why basically we are not as successful as we should be with the sort of budget we have in the European Union in terms of communication. We are in a sphere of communication where multiple projects are done. A lot of information is public, but nobody gets interested. And clearly you can see that with each new election where the abstention simply increase. So my point of view is that in the private sector, if you're a communication, you're a marketing manager and you lose 30% of your client, basically you don't stay long in your position. Mm-hmm. In Brussels, even after 20 years of losing our clients, we still sort of apply the same strategy and have the same people in place. My idea is that we can change that, and it doesn't mean obviously changing everybody, but maybe start from the scratch, think about why we have a problem, and learn from each other's practice. And so the whole session is going to be about that. How we tell stories visually, because Brussels is very good at writing paper, at producing a lot of written content, but as a sort of a bottleneck into transferring them to others, because visuals is a much more universal language than the vocabulary we use in Brussels.
But surely that is now accepted as an idea. I mean, you seem to be describing the situation a few years earlier when, yeah, it was true, there was no sort of learning from the outside. But I mean, you just have to tell anybody now about visual communications in Europe. You just have to tell them drowned Turkish boy on beach. I mean, you just saw the entire political wind in Europe shift by 90 degrees or more when that photograph hit the newspapers. Now, plenty of Turkish boys had drowned before on that. Well, not Turkish, but plenty of refugee boys had drowned, and that had been described again and again and again in newspaper articles. But it was the first time one got photographed, and it changed everything. So, I mean, is it really that bad what you're describing? Because it seems to me that people are slowly coming on board with the fact that they can't just produce text anymore.
I think media have always been present on the visual scene, obviously, and this image of the drone boy was actually carried out by medias, by newspapers and online medias. The European Union as a public communication sector here, we are far from that. We are very far from that. I mean, you just have to look at the sort of video we still produce when we need to explain something from any of the institutions. The sort of website we do. I mean, a couple of months ago, the European Commission changed its website to make it slightly more inviting for people. But before that, you needed a PhD in European law to actually go and find an information on this website. There is a whole service called Europe Direct, which is helping people just to find the information which is publicly available. So I think the visual is not part of the culture of most of people working here, simply because they come from backgrounds which are like economics, political sciences, or law. And this is not, obviously, the visual is not part of their educational background. When you go into science, you get much more visuals, because if you do biology, physics, chemistry, you need visuals to understand complex topics. In Brussels, we're slowly coming to that. And we are going definitely slower than any other part in the world that tries to communicate complex ideas, from companies to other NGOs in the world. We've been very involved with the TEDx Brussels community here, and I can say, and I'm sorry to say it, but the worst speakers that comes to TEDx are politicians.
Yeah. Sure.
Period. And so that's something we really want to change, and I think it's small step by step to understand we're not that good and we need to progress.
So the speaker that you're talking about from the ESA, his main thrust is going to be not just about what visual communications is and why it's important, but also how do you get that cultural change to convince people to do that. When I heard about that, I think that this campaign, the ESA's campaign, won an award recently. Aurélie Voltat was at the jury, and I pointed out on LinkedIn that in fact NASA did this. Tweeting in the first person, so the probe tweets in, I'm approaching the comet. NASA did that 1 or 2 years earlier, and so was it really that hard? Because the easiest thing to do when you want to change somebody's mind in the institutions is to point that another institution not that different, and NASA and the ESA are not that different. Another institution has successfully done that.
Yeah. So what I heard from Mark is that the actual award you're talking about, the Twitter campaign, was run by the German Space Agency.
Okay.
And the European Space Agency, the big chunk of the campaign was this movie they did. So the movie is basically a science fiction movie taking place 10,000 years from now, with an actor from Game of Thrones, which was quite interesting to get on board.
Yeah.
And they're telling the possibility of this mission. So it's the first mission where humanity is catching a comet in space. I mean, that's quite incredible.
Mm-hmm.
The most incredible thing is that you need to make a movie so that people get interested in the fact that humanity catch a comet. That's another story. So the movie itself was premiered in London for the Science Fiction Film Festival. And the beauty of it is that they started with a trailer that didn't mention anywhere that it was, first, not a real science fiction movie, and secondly, that it was produced by the European Space Agency. So people were expecting that a new feature movie of science fiction featuring one guy from Game of Thrones would appear from nowhere. Nobody heard about it, and it's going to launch in cinemas. I think the whole strategy was brilliant. And to pass this strategy, and I think this is the most interesting part of the session, is that Professor McCorgrean needed to really push the idea in a very particular way, and I'm not saying more about that, inside the institution, so that first, it will not die by committee decision. Secondly, they could really have the ambition to talk to people, not only to talk to their own hierarchy or their own institution. And you were mentioning NASA, to actually compete with NASA on the global scale, which means the European Space Agency is equivalent to NASA in the mind of people. And so far, it was not the case. NASA has this whole big cultural background behind it. European Space Agency is younger and need to push a bit more its message outside. But now I think you really managed to do that. We have the same thing than the Americans.
So how big was this film? I mean, was it a fully feature-length film, or was it like
7 minutes movie?
Right, so they did a 30-second trailer about a 7-minute film, but the trailer looked like it was for a 2-hour film.
Absolutely. That was
That is, I can't imagine anybody at the European Commission going for that. That's really, really radical, and I'm going to go to your session just to find out how they did that.
Super.
Because the ESA, I've worked with them a bit in the past. My background is in physics, so I don't understand why anybody would need to, be fooled by a film in order to get interested in landing on a comet. That's the sort of thing I grew up on, mother's milk science fiction. But yeah, it's true. People do need that sort of thing. Ezri, what do you think of that? I mean, you're very strong on visual communication as well. With the European Training Foundation or your other clients, how would you try to sell that idea to a client that let's make a feature film, or at least pretend to?
I think if I could persuade them that we get celebrity actors involved, that would help. But
there's a budgetary issue here. You need to convince them to spend the money on that it's not going to be a completely expensive disaster.
Exactly, and also I think what you have to be careful of, that it's not just a flash in the pan that doesn't really change things. Charlelie, you said something very interesting about the need to convey complex ideas, and that need is growing all the time because the world is becoming more complex, and the sorts of problems that institutions, organizations, individuals need to solve are becoming more complex. So I think that growing complexity is demanding that we do things in a different way. At the same time, again, as we all know, individuals, organizations, and institutions are all very resistant to change. So getting it right is always really, really difficult, whether you're trying to bring in a very novel form of communication to a particular organization, or just dealing with a sort of interpersonal situation. I think personally what's more important is to focus on values and principles, and then find the right channels and vehicles and so on. And I think that is evidenced very much by the point you made, Matthew, about the horrific image of that poor little child who drowned. It's certainly got a reaction, but the question is, will it lead to sustainable change? And that's what we have to think about when we're working with organizations using visual media or anything else, is, what are the values and what is the sort of whole organization situation, as well as what are the specific tools and techniques that we can use to get people interested.
Yeah, to get people interested and to capture something visually without hiding the complexity is, I think, a real challenge, because I think it's really interesting that Charlelie's speaker at the conference is talking about science communication, because, as I mentioned, I've got a physics background and I came to Brussels as a science journalist. And, you know, when you're talking about trying to communicate science, you have exactly the same problem as trying to communicate Europe. Science is important, it takes training to understand, it's full of jargon, it's sort of everywhere but poorly understood, and it's relevant to a lot of people, and there's a lot of bullshit being said about it. And you can say just substitute science for Europe, and you've got a sentence which we'd all recognise. And I wrote a blog post a few years ago about this, because when you're trying to communicate science and you have to involve the scientists, they hate simplification. You know, it's very complicated. You know, have you ever tried to write a sexy story by interviewing a scientist, and you try to get them to say, you know, could I say that 20%, there's a 20% effect here? And they'd say, well, that would depend on what you mean by effect. And, you know, because they've spent 3 years of their life doing a research, and they don't want it simplified down into a soundbite, and let alone, you know, some sort of image which misses, which sort of caricaturizes, if you like, their research. And you have exactly the same thing with technocrats. They spent 3 years of their life on a EU directive. You know, and there's lots of nuance. It's really complicated, because life is complicated and the EU is doubly complicated. And you try to capture that in an image, they're going to say, but that's too simplistic. And there is nothing more insulting to for a bureaucrat to say. That's the worst word in their armory. That's simplistic. So how do you balance that?
If I may, most of my interventions are always based on the strategy of communication. I point that again, which is mostly lacking in Brussels, because when you do not have a clear objective, obviously it's very difficult to measure if you reached it or not. When you need to communicate an idea, you can't communicate the same sort of idea and the same level of complexity to everyone, because you need to catch some people into, first, the fact that it exists, and you need to drive others in the fact that it's advancing. So if we're talking of EU legislation, you have people who never heard about the EU, you have the people who heard about the EU but do not get that it works in this sector. Then you have people who already know that this sector exists and might be involved with it and want to know the novelty into the EU legislation. So you have different sort of messages, different sort of levels of complexity. The problem with the things you mentioned, someone saying that it's simplistic, is because the objective is not clear. You can't talk in the same way to everyone. You can't talk about the same level of complexity to everyone. So if you divide well your objectives, and you know that this particular tool is going to reach this one, whether it's a video, an infographic, a website, a campaign, a lip-dub, whatever thing we come up in terms of tools, then the tool is the most fitted to reach these people with this message.
So you have a pipeline.
You have a pipeline, you have a funnel. When you want to sell a pair of shoes and you're Nike, you don't sell it the same way to someone who never bought Nike and to someone who is addicted to Nike, obviously.
Sure.
And that's the thing that everybody needs to understand here in Brussels. You cannot have one vehicle for every purpose. You need to have different vehicles and different messaging.
Well, I agree, obviously. Ezri, you were nodding a lot then too.
Yeah, well, I just couldn't help reminding myself of something that Albert Einstein said, which is that if you can't explain it to a child, you didn't understand it in the first place. So yeah, I think there's an element of some of the attitudes that people show towards complexity are actually based on protection of vested interests and status. So I think that that needs to be taken into account, but also I would completely agree with what Charlelie is saying. From a strategic communication perspective, you have to have objectives. Those objectives have to be aligned to the objectives of an organisation. They can't be separate from or irrelevant to whatever the organisation is trying to achieve. And you certainly do have to consider the different needs of different groups with whom you're communicating. But at the same time, we need to shift more towards a conversational model and less towards move away from a broadcast model. So that's again something that it will be interesting to see in EuroPCom how much that becomes part of the conference discussions, because I feel that a lot of the time, particularly institutions, for understandable reasons, their default position is broadcast mode. It's an SOS, we call it, send out stuff. and not real engagement, because it's just more difficult, it's more complex, and you don't always hear back what you're expecting to hear. When I did a blog post about Rapido for the IABC conference in San Francisco earlier this year, and I quoted Winston Churchill, who said the best argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with any voter. But you know, so the danger is that people you engage in conversation won't say the things that you want to hear. But nevertheless, to quote Churchill again, forgive me, you know, democracy is democracy is the worst form of government in the world, apart from all the others. So I think, you know, from a strategic communications perspective, the idea of engaging all your stakeholder groups in conversation is the worst idea in the world, apart from all the others.
Yeah. Well, what I like very much in your session, Ezri, and the format you adapt also, is that you're telling people basically that their presentation is important, but what is more important is that the public who listen to it needs to be energized, and that they are the focus of everything. It's talking to these people in the way they will appreciate it the most.
Yeah.
And so the speaker is supposed to do things to help that conversation happen. In the session I will moderate, I asked the two speakers if they were okay with one thing that is very, very different in conferences around Brussels. Is a very simple thing. Ask if they would accept to have ping-pong questions and answers from the audience. Someone asks a question and they answer immediately. That's a very simple thing that exists everywhere in the world, but in Brussels we have a problem with that. We collect questions and we answer no. So once you collect 6 or 7 of them, you can answer whatever to everybody.
Yeah, that's a dirty trick.
Exactly. And the two speakers are really into this conversation mode, saying like, you have a problem, you ask a question, I answer it, and then we have another question. And so each answer benefits everyone because it's specific. And I think that's, yeah.
I think it's a really good idea. I think it also highlights the fact that you need to work with everybody who's coming to the conference, not just the speakers, in order to get that kind of interaction going. You know, obviously if you've got 900 people in the room and one speaker, it needs to be managed. And grouping questions is just a chair's standard way of trying to manage that. But with the involvement of the whole conference, you can certainly develop new approaches, and that was one of the, again, another factor in the thinking behind Rapido, was that when we first devised it, I stipulated that no speaker, nobody who was already a speaker at the conference could do a Rapido presentation. It could only be delegates, because otherwise what you get is 10 people getting up on the stage saying either something they've already said or trying to advertise their forthcoming session. Yeah. And the whole point was to create, if you like, it was a bit of a ping-pong idea. Let's get, you know, 10. We only have time for 6 at EuroPCom, but let's get a bunch of people up who aren't on the speaker list, and let them have their say, tell their story.
I was going to suggest that I like the idea of Rapido energizing the audience. There's a bad echo, by the way. It just came on. I don't know who it is. Anyway, I love the idea how it would energize things, but then your session is at the very end of the conference. Wouldn't it work at the beginning? I mean, what if you had some sort of online competition where people who were coming anyway could pitch, I want to do a Rapido, I want to talk 5 minutes about this, and they get selected and they get to kick off the conference, to get the conference started with that sort of energetic session. It's
a great idea, and in fact one of the brand extensions, if you like, for Rapido that we're working on is pop-up Rapido, which would do exactly what you're describing. It wouldn't even have to happen in a auditorium. It would happen in the coffee session, or it would happen in the corridor, where you would just have a sort of, you know, a banner saying pop-up Rapido, and anybody could go and stand there for 5 minutes and do their session. So I think there are lots of ways that we could you know, rework the idea to do exactly what you're saying and get more people involved in creating the content of events, as well as being passive recipients of, you know, the wisdom of the great and the good, which we still need. Don't get me wrong, we still need to bring brilliant people who have done amazing things to come and talk to us about it. I have no problem with that.
Yeah. How would you do that, Charlelie, if you if a number of people were given the task of attending conference sessions, and every half a day, they would launch, for example, every morning and every afternoon, they would launch the afternoon or that morning with a few Rapido sessions taken from the preceding few hours of the conference to like summarize the last half a day of the conference for them to launch the next one. How would you gather images from a conference? Because a conference is not very telegenic. It's just a bunch of people, you know, standing around in suits and ties and business dresses talking.
Yeah. Since we've been working a lot with TEDx speakers, and I think there's really sort of the top of the basket in speakers. Most of them come with simply stock images. They go on a stock database of images, but just the fact that they select the right images makes it very different from what we think about stock images most of the time. You have very emotionally engaging visuals. I mean, a visual, an image, is done to put the context about an idea. It's not there to explain every detail, because nobody, and except graphic designers, artists who really masterize the visual art, understand the symbolic of an image very well. And an image carries one sort of surrounding meaning. It gives you the perspective about something. You were saying you worked in physics. I mean, it's very interesting to see that most of physical phenomena which are discovered are first represented by artists. It's an artist view about it. It's sort of synthesize the details, but it's mostly about giving finally a first visual approach about it, so people feel it better. If you talk about complex phenomenon, the first guy will come up with illustrating the spin or the chord theories. This guy wins the imagination of people. And I think that's what visuals are done for, to project yourself into the universe, not to explain in details every piece of meaning. So if people were to organize Rapido sessions, I would definitely give them access to a good database, a curator and a graphic designer to help them compose quickly their speech with, I don't know how many images you use. If it's Pechakucha style, maybe 20, because it can be curated, help people get more into the topic, but that's it. It's not about seeing all the details and say, but don't you notice in the top left corner that there was this symbol and you should have seen it? No, it's not done for that. It's to help the speaker propagate his universe. That's it.
Okay. I love the idea of having Rapido presentations put together on site with the help of you know, graphic artists or with access to you know, an image library, so that people could do that. I think that would be amazing.
Yeah, well, it's an outgrowth of the idea of having, you know, people, you know, doing sketches of conferences, you know, capturing concepts and doing cartoons and things like that, which has become a bit trendy the last few years. And I'm always on the lookout for ways where the essence of a conference and some of the findings of a conference can be shared outside the conference venue with anybody who's watching it outside. And, you know, my first experience with that was 2001 with web streaming of a conference, and these little postage-sized videos, and you know, the first thing I did was, we're spending how much on this? And I looked at the traffic and cut. You know, it was just useless. And now the bandwidth is there, but it's still completely useless. You need to have somebody there capturing the essence of it, transmuting that into something visual, and then sending that out. And then there's a call to action there that sends them back to the full slide share, the full page about the conference workshop, and more information. But it's the way of getting it out there, which brings me back to that video, the film, the video that the ESA did, Charlelie. Was there any sort of call to action at the end of that video that would take people through the funnel or the pipeline to go from somebody who just fell for a trick and watched a 7-minute film, and taking them beyond that to actually learning more about what the ESA does and about the science and all of that? You know, taking them down the funnel so they become progressively more interested and more educated about that particular project.
I don't want to sort of step over the speaker will explain most of this part, but basically the setup and experience was that the movie was launched before they actually woke up the robot who had landed on the comet. So basically it's a, I think, 6 or 7 years trip to the comet, putting a robot on top of it, and nobody knows at that moment if it's gonna wake up or not. Maybe the robot doesn't work. And so the whole movie is called Ambition for one reason, is that whether it fails or it's a success, people would feel the fact that we managed at least to put all this power together to send a probe on this comet that is 7 years on the distance. And the campaign means you can get interested to the whole things happening right now. It's immediate. So it worked for that. The actual number of views on the video is not really interesting. It was over 3 or 4 million, but the fact that every media started to understand that something was happening and we needed to carry on the story. And they made it. Can you imagine the risk for an institution saying, like, if it fails, what are we doing with this movie, saying, like, we send something? I mean, if it failed. Imagine the engineers who were scared about having their work on the daylight, you know, and they were not even sure it worked. And that's why the movie is called Ambition, and the whole concept carried by the movie is ambition. It's more important than anything else.
I understand what you're saying about how you don't want to give away all the secrets of your conference workshop. So I'm going to have to wait and see. Actually, wait and see. I'm looking forward to it because I'm burning to find out, you know, how he managed to convince an institution like the ESA to do a video with a professional actor. You know what I mean? For a project which was not actually going to be ready for 7 years. I mean, you know, that's an extraordinary risk to take, because if the film turned out to be crap, and mostly they are, most corporate videos are dreadful, then people are going to say, what a massive waste of money. You could have sent a second probe for that, you know, for that budget. Do you know what I mean? Somebody should do a website just bringing together all the terrible European videos that have been done. Does anybody remember the transport one, which celebrated the transport white paper? No. And it literally had a tornado or a stream of A4 sheets of paper flooding across the sky, you know, something that's going to, all this red tape's going to bind us together. It was astonishing, you know. And these things actually happen, you know, they actually get commissioned. So, oh well, anyway, I'm sorry, I'm just going off on a tangent. We should finish. We've been at this for 3/4 of an hour. Thank you, Ezri. Any more comments? Any more questions?
No, I just wanted to very briefly mention that I've got 6 fantastic speakers for the Rapido session from the New Europeans, from the Centre for Social Innovation. We've got somebody from Europe Direct, actually, from the European Training Foundation, from the Aarhus 2017 European Capital of Culture programme, and a journalist and Latin American affairs advisor to the EU. So it's a very eclectic mix of people, and I really hope that we'll get from them what's happened in previous Rapido sessions, which is each individual story has its own kind of trajectory, but put them together and something else emerges, and that's what I'm really looking forward to.
I'm looking forward to it too. Charlelie, anything else?
I just wanted to say, because come back in 1 minute maximum, what you ask about the Rapido sessions being organized on the spot. I said, like, we need to create images. What I meant really is to add professionals doing that. Graphic designers who work in the field are the best possible people to do something like this. And for the ESA campaign, the European Space Agency campaign, they asked a superb director from a Polish company. It's called Mathew. He was nominated at the Oscar for animation. This guy was a superb artist, and this is why the movie was not crap. And I think when you ask the good people who are passionate about a topic to work on a topic, you get the best results. And
if you let them.
If you let them.
If you let them. I used to work for a company that we did a lot of really great things, and the commission used to say, why don't you do as good for us as you do for them? And it was, well, they let us do it. You know, they let us edit the magazine, they let us build the website, they just let us get on with it, you know. And when you have a really high-profile thing like a video, you get that effect by committee. And this is what I'm really looking forward to hearing about, how not only did he sell the idea into the institution, but then he managed to shield it from the institution to allow the quality to be, you know, that somebody inside the institution must have been brave. And that's nice to see it happens occasionally.
Super.
Okay, guys, I really appreciated this chat. Thank you very much. I look forward to seeing both of your sessions.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks.
Catch you later. Bye.
See ya.
Bye-bye.
Bye.